March 10th, 1943. North Atlantic, 400 miles south of Iceland. The sea was calm, too calm. In the conning tower of U-432, Kapitänleutnant Heinz Opitz watched the pale horizon through his Zeiss binoculars, the surface glassy under the afternoon haze. Diesel fumes clung to the air. It was their fifth patrol since leaving La Pallice, and their fuel reserves had fallen below half. The crew had not seen a convoy in 3 days, nor any aircraft. Then, just after 1600 hours, the hydrophone operator called out, "Propellers bearing 095, fast, heavy screws." Opitz ordered periscope depth. The Type VII boat slid beneath the waves, her ballast tanks hissing. The familiar rhythm of depth charge anticipation settled over the control room, men whispering, lights dimmed, every movement purposeful. The soundman adjusted his headset, his voice low but steady. Multiple destroyers. Approaching fast. There was no panic. This was a drill they had, practiced dozens of times. They would dive deep 200, maybe 250 meters, ride out the attack, and slip away beneath the thermocline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But that day, something was different. When the first explosions arrived, they were distant, muffled concussions that rolled through the hull like distant thunder. The crew exchanged puzzled glances. Too deep, the charges weren't detonating near them at all. Opitz allowed himself a smile. "Amerikanische Amateur," he muttered. "American amateurs." He assumed they had set their depth charges too deep, a common error among inexperienced destroyer crews. The men relaxed slightly, believing the enemy had misjudged their depth. But 5 minutes later, the detonations began again, closer this time, sharper. The hull flexed, dust fell from the light fixtures. The soundman removed his headset, blood trickling from his ear. Then came the terrifying realization these new charges were exploding far below their known crush depth. The Americans weren't missing. They had simply changed the rules of the hunt. The scene that day aboard U-432 marked a shift that no one in the Kriegsmarine had anticipated. It wasn't merely that the Allies had improved their weapons, it was that they had learned to predict the German escape pattern itself. For nearly 4 years, the U-boat arm had trusted one unspoken law of survival. No depth charge could follow them below 400 feet. That belief etched into every training manual, every commander's instinct was about to collapse. At the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, the physics of survival were simple. The Type VII U-boat could safely dive to about 220 meters, roughly 700 feet. Though official doctrine limited combat depth to 160 meters. Beyond that, the steel hull began to groan under pressure, the hull plates flexing by fractions of an inch. Depth charges, introduced during the Great War, relied on mechanical hydrostatic fuses. A small diaphragm inside the weapon sensed surrounding water pressure and triggered detonation at a preset depth, 5,100, or at most 250 feet. The early war British Mark VII charge carried 200 pounds of TNT, designed for submarines operating in the shallow approaches to the British Isles. For years, this technological limitation defined the cat-and-mouse game beneath the Atlantic. German crews knew that if they dove deep enough, they could often wait out a bombardment until the destroyers moved on. By the winter of 1941, many U-boat veterans referred to the 200-meter zone as the Dark Sanctuary. It was terrifying, yes, but it was survivable. That confidence was reinforced by experience. From 1939 through early 1943, the Kriegsmarine lost roughly 10 submarines per month, even at the height of the Allied convoy system. Admiral Karl Dönitz's Wolfpacks could still sink more tonnage than the Allies could build. By early 1943, German optimism bordered on certainty. The war in the Atlantic, though brutal, still seemed winnable. The propaganda films from UFA studios showed sleek submarines slicing through grey water, their young crews laughing as they loaded torpedoes. Radio broadcasts praised them as the Knights of the Deep, modern descendants of the privateers who once ruled the seas. In ports like Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, and La Rochelle, the submarine pens echoed with marching bands and speeches about technological mastery. Germany, they believed, had perfected undersea warfare, but beneath that confidence was a fatal assumption that the enemy's weapons would always lag behind their own tactics. The truth was that by the beginning of 1943, the U-boat arm had become predictable. Allied scientists, particularly those working in the British Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development and the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, had compiled thousands of after-action reports from convoy escorts. They noticed a pattern. Every time a submarine survived an attack, it followed the same maneuver: dive steeply to between 500 and 600 feet, then hold course silently until the destroyers left. In Washington, the new submarine tracking room of the U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet analyzed these reports with the precision of a mathematician. A memo dated January 24, 1943, summarized the problem. Current depth charge settings insufficient against Type VII U-boats operating at extreme depths. Recommend extension of fuse calibration to 600 feet. That same month, the Bureau of Ordnance began field testing an improved hydrostatic pistol that could withstand the pressure of 300 pounds per square inch, equivalent to 650 feet of depth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The result was a small change in mechanism, but a massive change in psychology. When the new Mark VI depth charge pistol entered production in February 1943, destroyer crews could now set charges to explode at double the previous maximum depth. Few U-boat commanders realized this. The Germans, confident in their escape doctrine, assumed the Americans were still using the older Mark VII pattern charges detonating at around 250 feet. So when Kapitänleutnant Opitz and his crew heard explosions booming faintly below them that day, they believed they were safe. They didn't know that those misses were exactly on target, set to detonate hundreds of feet below their assumed sanctuary. The transformation that followed was both technical and psychological. By the spring of 1943, Allied hunter-killer groups centered around escort carriers like USS Bogue and USS Card combined radar-equipped aircraft with destroyers carrying these new deep-set charges. Aircraft forced submarines to dive. Destroyers then used sonar to track them at depths never before reachable. The German hydrophones, calibrated for mid-depth acoustics, struggled to pick up sonar pings that now came from far above. The Atlantic, once a vast domain of concealment, had turned into an acoustic trap. The change in fuse depth might have seemed a minor adjustment on paper, a few turns of a wrench on the charge's depth dial, but it forced a complete inversion of survival instinct. Lieutenant Hans Dietrich, a sound operator aboard U-600, later recalled during Allied interrogation. "We heard the first explosions, very distant, like thunder. Then the next series came closer. We thought they were overshooting. Then came one that seemed to explode underneath us. It lifted the boat. The captain looked at me and said only, 'They know our depth.' It was not just fear, it was betrayal of experience itself. Every lesson drilled into them in the submarine school at Neustadt had taught that the deeper you went, the safer you were. Now, depth itself had become a liability. In the weeks that followed, reports began filtering through Donitz's headquarters at Kurneval. Boats that had dived to extreme depths were vanishing without a trace. The pattern was unmistakable. U-529, lost February 15, 1943, cause unknown. U-606, destroyed February 22 after deep diving beneath convoy on 166. U-444, lost early March after prolonged depth charge pursuit. In each case, survivors, if any, spoke of explosions below them, ruptures in ballast tanks, and crushing pressure that followed seconds later. By late March, German naval engineers began to suspect the truth. Intercepted Allied documents hinted at a new type of detonator capable of 600-foot settings. Reports from Bletchley Park later confirmed that decrypted German communications from this period included increasingly desperate requests for countermeasures. But by then, it was too late. The psychological shift had already begun. Submarine commanders who once treated depth as refuge now hesitated to descend too far. Others, refusing to believe the reports, dived deeper still past the safe limit, only to discover that steel has no mercy when faith collides with physics. By May of 1943, the same month, Admiral Dönitz called back his U-boats from the North Atlantic. The myth of safe depth had collapsed entirely. Crews began to refer to the deep ocean as Das Eiserne Grab, the Iron Grave. Each attack blurred the line between tactics and terror. Soundmen flinched at faint pings. Engineers watched the pressure gauges climb beyond safety. Officers whispered prayers they had learned as children. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that Allied scientists were already working on an even deadlier refinement. The proximity-fused hedgehog mortar, which would eliminate the guesswork of depth settings altogether. But that revelation would come later. For the men aboard U-432 and dozens like her, the moment they heard the distant thunder of missed depth charges was the moment their world inverted. They had not escaped the Americans. The Americans had found them exactly where they thought they were safe. Night of April 21st, 1943. The North Atlantic was black and windless. U-221, under Kapitänleutnant Heinz Opitz, drifted at periscope depth after 16 hours of pursuit. For 2 days, the destroyers of Task Group 21.11 had stalked them without pause. The Americans no longer hunted in short bursts. They circled, listened, and struck. Again, forcing the submarine deeper each time. The crew was exhausted. Carbon dioxide levels rose. Condensation dripped from the ceiling like cold sweat. The diesel engineers had long stopped checking the gauges. They simply watched the needle tremble near the red line as the hull compressed another fraction of an inch. At 0200, the first sonar pings echoed. Then came the Propellers' 2 destroyers, closing fast. Depth charges, ready. The order was routine, almost ritual. Men braced themselves. The first explosions came higher, the sound sharp, metallic. The hull shuddered but held. Then silence. For 30 seconds, nothing but the heartbeat of the ship, the creak of steel, the hiss of compressed air, the faint rasp of the helmsman's breath. Then the second pattern struck 3 detonations, one above, one abeam, one below. The lower blast was different, deeper. It reverberated through the keel like the sound of a mountain splitting. Light bulbs shattered. The forward torpedo room flooded. Trager ordered 190 meters. The depth gauge spun past 200. A bolt snapped from the bulkhead. The hull groaned, metal shrieking against pressure it was never meant to bear. "Sir," whispered the engineering officer, "we are at 230. Trager hesitated. The manual said crush depth began at 250. He nodded once. "Hold course." Silent running. Another explosion boomed below. The floor plates buckled upward. When U-221 failed to report 2 days later, Dönitz's headquarters listed her simply as missing in North Atlantic, presumed lost. She was one of 41 submarines destroyed that month, twice the number of new boats commissioned. The men who fought that undersea war did not measure time by days or weeks. They measured it by depth and by detonations. A veteran crewman of U-92 later recalled, "When we heard the first charges, we counted them aloud, 1, 2, 3, and waited for the hull to bend. But when the explosions came from below, the counting stopped. You cannot count what you do not understand." The shift had begun quietly, not with new weapons, but with new arithmetic. The Allied Mark VII depth charge, standard through 1942, carried 200 pounds of TNT and could be set only to 300 feet. In March 1943, the United States introduced the Mark IX, a heavier steel-cased weapon with 300 pounds of Torpex explosive and a redesigned hydrostatic pistol, calibrated to 600 feet. The British followed with their own deep-setting modification to the Mark VII, increasing maximum depth to 500 feet. The two nations' ordnance bureaus shared fuse data through the Atlantic Combined Ordnance Committee, ensuring interchangeability among escort vessels. To U-boat crews, the results were invisible. A depth charge looked the same from the periscope, a dark cylinder tumbling through the wake. Changed was the delay between its release and the first shockwave. Engineers later measured it precisely. At 200 feet, detonation occurred about 10 seconds after splash. At 600 feet, nearly 25 seconds. That long silence between splash and explosion deceived many commanders. They assumed the attack had missed. By the time realization came, the shockwave was already climbing toward them. The Allies combined these new charges with sonar tactics that turned the ocean into a three-dimensional map. The British called it creeping attack. One ship held continuous sonar contact, transmitting bearings to a second ship that advanced silently without pinging. When the second vessel reached optimal range, she released an entire pattern of deep-set charges over the predicted submarine position. The method required disciplined minutes of coordination, exact timing of detonations, but it was devastating. Submarines could no longer predict where the next pattern would fall. German sonar experts attempted to counter this by ordering depth change during run-abrupt maneuvers of 50 to 100 feet after each detonation. But the new deep settings negated even this. Each explosion created pressure differentials that echoed for miles, interfering with the submarine's own hydrophones. In effect, the deeper the U-boat fled, the blinder it became. The technical shift produced an equally violent psychological one. In the early years of the war, depth charge attacks were frightening but familiar. Crews described them almost clinically, timing the intervals, guessing enemy bearing, and noting structural sounds afterward. By mid-1943, reports from surviving crews revealed a new tone confusion, disbelief, and superstition. Some believed the Allies had developed magnetic charges that followed their hulls. Others suspected traitors transmitting positions from home bases. In reality, they were victims of mathematics. At 600 feet, water pressure exceeds 270 pounds per square inch. The Mark IX's Torpex filler produced a shockwave moving at more than 1 mile per second. Even if the explosion occurred 50 feet away, the reflected pressure was enough to deform a Type VII's outer hull plating by several millimeters. Engineers at the Deutsche Werke shipyard tested recovered fragments from damaged boats and concluded that repeated deep detonations could cause fatigue cracking in weld seams, even without direct hits. Thus, a submarine might survive 1 or 2 such attacks, only to implode days later when diving again. Among the most detailed accounts of this new warfare came from U-427, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Carl Gunther Bale. On April 29, 1945, near war's end, his boat endured more than 300 depth charges from Canadian destroyers HMCS Street, John and Edmundston off Norway. Bale later wrote, "It was as if the sea itself had become a weapon. The explosions did not merely shake the hull, they entered our bodies. Teeth broke, instruments shattered, the lights turned green from battery gas. When the charges began to detonate beneath us, the men stopped praying. They simply waited for the steel to end." Though Bale survived the war, his words described the cumulative terror that had begun 2 years earlier. For Dönitz, the implications were catastrophic. The U-boat arm was losing experienced officers faster than replacements could be trained. Each sunken boat represented not just 45 men, but years of tactical learning. In May 1943, 54 submarines were lost, 1/4 of the operational fleet. In the same month, only 19 new boats left the shipyards. The happy time, as U-boat men had once called their dominance, was over. The British Naval Staff history later summarized the transformation bluntly. By mid-1943, anti-submarine weapons had achieved depths exceeding the safe limits of German design. The ocean had ceased to offer concealment. Yet within the steel corridors of the U-boat bunkers, denial persisted. German propaganda continued to celebrate daring patrols and heroic escapes, even as returns dwindled. Training manuals still advised that depth confers safety. A contradiction grew between doctrine and experience. Captains reported attacks from impossible depths. Engineers warned that Type VII hulls were near their structural limit. Commanders of the new Type IX boats, larger, heavier, designed for distant operations, found their size a liability, the deeper detonations striking with proportionally greater force. To understand the human cost of this shift, one must descend into the sensory world of the control room during a deep attack. Imagine it: red lights glowing, air thick with oil and sweat. The only sounds are the slow beat of the electric motors and the faint pinging from above. The hull creaks rhythmically as pressure increases, first like distant thunder, then like the groan of a cathedral door. At 100 meters, the men speak in whispers. At 150, voices fade entirely. The depth gauge needle trembles. When the first explosion comes from below, the entire deck jumps upward. Instruments burst from panels. Seawater sprays through gasket seams. Every man waits for the follow-up blast that may or may not come. Veterans later said that after enough attacks, they could tell the depth of a detonation by sound alone. A near miss above the hull produced a flat crack. A distant explosion below produced a rolling boom that echoed through the keel. The introduction of 600-foot settings confused these senses. The explosions no longer followed expected rhythm or direction. The crew could no longer read the battle. Some commanders attempted countermeasures. U-264 under Hartwig Lux tried deploying oil slicks and debris at extreme depth to simulate destruction, hoping to deceive sonar operators into marking the contact as sunk. The trick sometimes worked, but only once. The next group of destroyers would drop charges set deeper still. Others experimented with hover diving, maintaining neutral buoyancy at mid-depth to minimize sonar reflection. But the longer a submarine stayed deep, the faster its air reserves dwindled and its hull warmed, increasing internal condensation. Moisture dripped into electrical circuits, causing shorts that could ignite battery fumes. In desperation, Dönitz ordered research into thicker pressure hulls. The result was the experimental Type XXI electroboot, capable of operating at 400 meters and running submerged for days. But by the time the first boats reached operational status in early 1945, the Atlantic campaign was already lost. On the Allied side, the transformation was seen not as technological triumph, but as statistical necessity. The tonnage war was arithmetic: sink more U-boats than the enemy could replace. To achieve this, the Americans calculated the probability of kill for each weapon pattern. Reports from Task Group 21.13 showed that shallow charges had a kill rate of roughly 2% per pattern. Deep-set patterns, using mixed settings from 200 to 600 feet, raised that probability to 9%. The increase seemed small, but in a campaign involving thousands of attacks, it represented hundreds of destroyed submarines. Each destroyer carried 72 depth charges. A single engagement might expend half of them in coordinated barrages. The new deep settings required stronger charge pistols, but the U.S. Navy's industrial capacity could produce replacements faster than the Kriegsmarine could replace one boat. The war of attrition had turned physical depth into statistical doom. By autumn 1943, intercepted German radio traffic revealed a change in tone. Commanders reported depth charges exploding below our hulls and destroyers attacking from the sea bottom upward. The once arrogant confidence of the early Wolfpack years had vanished. Dönitz's own war diary for October noted, "Enemy weapons now capable of extreme depth, psychological strain on crews considerable, reports of panic during attacks increasing." He understood that morale was the last defense. Orders emphasized discipline and faith in leadership, but statistics eroded both. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 28,000 died, nearly 70%. The deepest dives, once proof of bravery, had become the path to suffocation. The irony was profound. The same instinct that had saved thousands of submariners in 1941 dive deeper now killed them in 1943. When Allied interrogators questioned survivors after the war, they often asked what moment they realized the tide had turned. Many answered not with dates or battles, but with sounds. A petty officer from U-569 recalled, "It was the silence after the first explosions. We thought they were too deep. Then the next pattern came and we heard the hull ringing. That was when we knew. The ocean no longer protected us." Another survivor described it more simply. The sea had changed sides. Technically, nothing mystical had occurred, just new fuses, new data, and relentless testing. Yet to the men trapped inside the pressure hulls, it felt as if the laws of physics had betrayed them. That betrayal altered submarine warfare forever. Post-war navies designed boats not around surface endurance but around survival depth and shock resistance. The lessons of 1943 informed the pressure hull standards of the Cold War's first generation of submarines. But in the spring of that year, for those still fighting, such lessons meant little. When U-432's crew heard the faint, delayed thunder of depth charges detonating, hundreds of feet below, they could not know they were witnessing the end of an era. They could not know that each detonation was proof of a new calculus, a war fought not by men's courage but by engineers' equations. They only knew that the ocean, once their shield, had become their enemy. May 1943 was the month the ocean stopped lying. For years, Admiral Karl Dönitz had measured the Atlantic in tonnage sunk, not men lost. His morning briefings at Carnival always began with numbers. 21 ships destroyed, 110,000 tons. Victories sounded like statistics, not funerals. But by the third week of that May, the numbers reversed themselves. 41 U-boats gone, then 54. For the first time, Dönitz ordered the withdrawal of all U-boats from the North Atlantic. It was not a retreat of strategy, it was surrender to mathematics. When Dönitz had conceived the Wolfpack strategy in 1940, it was revolutionary. Coordinated groups of submarines attacking at night on the surface overwhelmed convoy escorts that lacked radar. The sea belonged to the hunters, but by 1943, the Allies had rewritten the playbook. Airborne radar, lee lights, sonobuoys, and deep-set depth charges closed every escape path. In the early years, the U-boat's best defense had been invisibility, the ocean's sheer volume. There were too many cubic miles of salt water for sonar or aircraft to patrol effectively. But when the Americans introduced escort carriers like USS Bogue, Card, and Santee, invisibility itself began to collapse. Each carrier carried a dozen aircraft equipped with ASV, air-to-surface vessel, radar, and magnetic anomaly detectors. These planes could spot a periscope, wake at 5 miles, force the submarine to dive, and then guide the destroyers to the contact. Once submerged, the German crew entered what they thought was safety, the deep zone beneath 400 feet. What they found instead was the detonation of their own myth. The new deep charges meant that every tactic Dönitz had taught, the crash dive, the silent run, the deep wait, was now a trap. The ocean had been inverted. The deeper they fled, the closer they came to death. In submarine warfare, survival depended on faith in one's captain, one's machinery, and in the unspoken promise that somewhere below lay safety. When that faith was broken, something inside the U-boat arm fractured. Crew reports began to describe psychological decay. Men flinched at every creak of the hull. A leaking valve was mistaken for an approaching destroyer. Some engineers developed pressure hallucinations, the sensation of being crushed even at periscope depth. The Navy's psychological branch called it Tiefenfurcht, fear of depth. It was not cowardice but physiological collapse, the body reacting to constant expectation of implosion. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence from submarine bases revealed a tone of fatalism. A young petty officer wrote to his sister in Hamburg, "When the charges fall now, we no longer think of fighting, we think only of the next breath. The sea that once hid us has become our coffin." Veteran captains began refusing to dive beyond 150 meters. Others dove recklessly beyond 250, gambling that pressure would kill them faster than the enemy. The U-boat's greatest advantage, its captain's confidence, had been dismantled by a simple adjustment on an American fuse dial. Admiral Dönitz faced an impossible paradox. His submarine fleet, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was being annihilated by an enemy he could no longer outthink. In his diary entry for the 24th of May 1943, he wrote, "The enemy's technical advantage is now decisive. The deep charges destroy our boats even when no direct contact is made. Our weapons and tactics are no longer sufficient." He refused, however, to abandon the campaign entirely. Dönitz believed that new technology, the snorkel, radar-absorbent coatings, and the advanced Type XXI boats could reverse the tide. But the research lagged behind reality. The Type XXI electroboot would not enter combat until 1945, and by then, Germany's fuel reserves were nearly gone. Meanwhile, the existing fleet was bleeding out. Between March and July 1943, the Allies sank 141 submarines, nearly half of the active force. Even worse, the men who survived brought back stories that shook the foundations of belief. In June 1943, U-505 barely survived an attack off the Cape Verde Islands. Oberleutnant Peter Zeiss later described it during interrogation after the war. The charges exploded so deep that the water pressure came through the rivets. It sounded as if the hull were screaming. We were below our red line 260 meters. The captain ordered the crew to lie flat. The hull flexed inward and then rebounded. We thought it was the end. Then silence, and we realized we were still alive. 3 months later, Scheck would take his own life, aboard the same submarine after another attack. His suicide, witnessed by the crew, symbolized the moral disintegration of the once proud U-boat arm. Another survivor from U-228 recalled, "It was the delay that killed the nerves. The bombs dropped, then nothing for 20 seconds. You start to believe you are safe. Then the sea below you opens and throws the boat upward. We began to fear silence more than explosions." Allied commanders recognized this psychological effect. Rear Admiral Daniel Gallery, who later captured U-505 intact, wrote in his after-action report, "By varying depth settings, we kept the submarine guessing. The goal was not always destruction, but confusion. A frightened crew makes noise. A noisy boat dies." The Kriegsmarine's engineers had built the Type VII hull for 220 meters maximum, but many boats exceeded that during combat. Theoretically, the crush depth, the point of structural failure, was around 280 meters. Pressure calculations were straightforward. Every 10 meters of seawater added 1 atmosphere. At 600 feet, roughly 180 meters, the external force reached 270 pounds per square inches. The Mark IX charge, detonating at that depth, created a shockwave exceeding 400 pounds per square inches within a 30-meter radius. No steel submarine of that era could endure a near miss. Some engineers proposed strengthening frames with thicker welds, but that required new shipyard templates. Germany's industrial resources were already stretched by Allied bombing, so the only immediate defense was hope and maneuver. But maneuvering was useless when the Hunter could reach any depth. From the Allied perspective, the defeat of the U-boats was a system, not a series of battles. Each convoy was a moving laboratory. Aircraft logged every sighting. Destroyers reported sonar contacts with precise coordinates. All data fed into the tracking rooms in Liverpool and Washington, where analysts plotted submarine losses by depth, pattern, and timing. When early, analyses showed that most surviving U-boats had dived beyond 500 feet. The conclusion was obvious: build charges to reach 600. In a sense, the Allies didn't need to outfight the Germans. They needed only to outmeasure them. The Bureau of Ordnance's 1943 memo put it succinctly: effective anti-submarine warfare is an engineering problem disguised as combat. This cold logic horrified even some participants. A British destroyer officer later wrote, "We dropped patterns until the sea frothed. There were no survivors, only air bubbles. It was war reduced to equations." By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer a battleground, it was a graveyard. In June alone, 25 U-boats were sunk. In July, 33 more. The convoy losses, once catastrophic, fell to almost negligible levels. For the first time, Allied ships could sail from Halifax to Liverpool under continuous air cover. The hunter-killer groups roamed the mid-Atlantic gap, no longer protecting convoys but actively seeking submarines. When Dönitz realized that his submarines could no longer inflict significant damage, he called them back to the Bay of Biscay. But even there, Allied aircraft struck them as they left port. The new deep-fuse charges were not just weapons, they were signals of Allied technological dominance. Each improvement in detonation depth forced the Germans to either design stronger submarines or accept higher losses. They could do neither quickly enough. The Battle of the Atlantic is often remembered as a contest of steel and sonar. Yet beneath those numbers lay the fragility of human endurance. Inside each U-boat were 45 men sharing 80 square meters of space, recycled air, and the knowledge that escape was impossible. When the deep charges began exploding beneath them, many described sensations akin to suffocation. Their ears bled from pressure differentials, lungs compressed during shock waves, nerves twitched uncontrollably. Medical reports from the U-boat school at Neustadt recorded increasing cases of Nervenerschöpfung, nervous exhaustion. Psychologists noted that even survivors of minor attacks displayed tremors and insomnia for weeks. To maintain morale, Dönitz issued orders forbidding discussion of rumors about new enemy weapons. The measure failed. Rumor spread faster than discipline. By late 1943, veteran submariners referred to the 600-foot detonations with a grim nickname, Die tiefe Wahrheit, the deep truth. That phrase captured more than fear. It encapsulated revelation. For the U-boat arm, depth had once been symbolic, the measure of mastery over nature, the proof of German engineering. Now it represented exposure, vulnerability, and inevitability. Each detonation at 600 feet was an experiment in physics and psychology. The Allies had not just found the submarines' bodies, they had found their beliefs. Dönitz later reflected during his post-war testimony at Nuremberg, "We lost not merely ships, but the idea of invulnerability. Once the enemy could strike us at any depth, the ocean itself turned hostile." That hostility marked the end of the old naval era when courage could overcome technology. By 1944, courage alone was obsolete. When the war ended in May 1945, 784 German submarines had been destroyed. Another 221 surrendered. Only a fraction completed more than 3 patrols. Survivors were haunted not by defeat, but by the manner of it unseen, mechanical, inevitable. Many post-war memoirs avoided describing the actual attacks, focusing instead on camaraderie, humor, or routine. The sound of the deep detonations, the booming silence, as one survivor called it, remained too personal, too incomprehensible. Allied crews, too, were changed. For them, anti-submarine warfare was efficient but joyless. A sonar operator aboard HMS Dianthus admitted years later, "We never saw them. We dropped charges and listened to the screams of the sea. When the contact vanished, someone said, 'Good kill,' but we knew 40 men had just died where no one could bury them." The Atlantic had become a cemetery without headstones. Ironically, the horror of 1943 accelerated submarine evolution. The Allies' deep fuse research laid the foundation for post-war pressure-resistant hulls, high-yield explosives, and advanced sonar. The lessons learned from destroying U-boats informed the design of the very submarines that would dominate the Cold War. Navy's Tang class of the late 1942 could dive to depths unimaginable in 1943, and each carried homing torpedoes born from the same laboratories that had perfected the deep-charge fuse. Germany's surviving engineers, working under Allied supervision, contributed to both American and Soviet submarine programs. The Type XXI's hydrodynamic shape became the blueprint for modern subs. Thus, the weapons that destroyed the U-boats also ensured their spiritual survival not as wolves, but as ghosts in steel reborn under new flags. In retrospect, the transformation of 1943 was not only technical. It represented the moral compression of industrial warfare. The men who designed deeper fuses never saw the faces of those they killed. They calculated efficiency, pressure, and yield. Their success meant annihilation carried out in silence hundreds of feet below. Philosopher Gunther Anders later described this distance as the shame of the perfected. For the submariners who died in the dark, there was no glory, only the knowledge that courage had met its mathematical limit. And yet, within that tragedy lay an enduring truth. Every innovation, no matter how deadly, begins with fear and ends with understanding. On the 4th of May 1945, Kapitänleutnant Helmut Franzke of U-318 received word of Germany's surrender. His crew, 23 men still alive after 3 years of war, surfaced near Narvik, Norway. Before scuttling the boat, Franzke gathered his men on deck. The North Atlantic was calm again. He said quietly, "Once we believed the deep would save us. It did not, but it kept our secret that we were only men." They opened the vents and watched the sea reclaim the hull. Within minutes, the water closed over it. No explosions. No noise, only silence, the same silence that had terrified and protected them. The phrase 600 feet deep is more than a measurement. It is the boundary between belief and knowledge, between human instinct and technological inevitability. For the U-boat arm, it marked the moment when their world inverted, when safety became danger and depth became destiny. In that moment, war itself changed. It ceased to be a contest of bravery and became a contest of comprehension. The submariners who vanished into that depth were not defeated by cowardice or by lack of skill. They were defeated by the evolution of understanding, by the relentless human drive to perfect destruction. Each depth charge that detonated at 600 feet was a small explosion in the history of faith, proof that even the most certain refuge can become the most perfect trap. In 1945, when the surrender came, the Atlantic grew silent for the first time in 6 years. No sonar pings, no oil slicks, no flares. The convoys steamed unhindered across grey water that only months earlier had been a killing ground. But the silence was not peace. It was the sound of absence. Hundreds of submarines lay scattered across the seabed, steel coffins resting where the pressure is absolute and memory does not reach. The war above had been loud and visible. Bombers, tanks, cities on fire. The war below ended in whispers, with men who drowned without witnesses. Between Iceland and Newfoundland, sonar surveys later revealed an invisible graveyard. Each wreck sits upright, half buried in silt, still shaped like motion arrested. Their names, U-402, U-640, U-752, appear on no monuments, only in naval registries and the echoes of sonar scans. Marine archaeologists who descended in submersibles during the 1,990 seconds reported something haunting. Many hulls remain intact, hatches sealed. The crews are still aboard. Pressure and darkness have preserved them better than time. To historians, these boats are data evidence of industrial warfare's precision. To sailors, they are warnings. Every depth mark, every bent propeller, is testimony to the day technology outgrew human instinct. From those losses came the blueprint of the modern submarine. Engineers studying captured U-boats realized that survival was no longer about bravery or discipline, but about design. Hull thickness, battery endurance, sonar stealth, all became lessons written in metal and blood. The post-war American Tang class, the Soviet Whiskey class, even the first nuclear submarines all traced their ancestry to the German Type XXI. The same idea that had failed to save Dönitz's men greater depth became the foundation for a new era. In a sense, the Germans had been right to believe in depth. They were merely outpaced by science. The Allies had proven that any refuge could be reached if one understood the physics. The Cold War would prove the opposite, that survival lay not in running deeper, but in remaining unseen altogether. The sea had turned from battlefield to deterrent a quiet abyss where nations hid their most destructive weapons. For the survivors, peace brought no release. Those few who returned to port found themselves strangers in a country reduced to rubble. In the new Germany, the U-boat veterans carried both pride and guilt, pride in endurance, guilt in futility. Many refused to speak of their patrols. When they did, their words came slow, filtered through decades of silence. Kapitänleutnant Heinz Opitz, one of the last surviving commanders, said in a 1970 interview, "The depth charges frightened us, yes, but not, because they killed. They reminded us that the world above had moved on, that our courage meant nothing against mathematics. It was perhaps the most honest eulogy of the U-boat war. Courage measured against physics, faith undone by innovation." In the decades that followed, naval museums displayed restored submarines as relics of engineering. Visitors marveled at their cramped quarters, their periscopes, their mechanical elegance. Few paused to imagine the moment of implosion, the pressure, the silence after a 600-foot detonation. Yet the moral question lingered. When war reaches such precision that men die without seeing their killers, who truly wins? The Allied victory in the Atlantic saved millions of tons of shipping, and with it, the Allied war effort. It was necessary, but necessary does not mean merciful. The scientists who perfected the deep fuse pistols later worked on torpedoes, then atomic weapons, each step another layer deeper into abstraction, destruction reduced to measurement. What began with a small adjustment on a depth charge fuse ended with the splitting of the atom. Today, oceanographers mapping the North Atlantic still record unexplained low-frequency noises, echoes bouncing between wrecks, currents, and trenches. Some call it coincidence, others superstition. But for submariners, even modern ones, sound is memory. Every ping, every echo carries a lineage back to those men who learned too late that silence could kill. When a sonar operator aboard a nuclear sub listens to the depths, he is hearing history vibrations that began in 1943, when the ocean changed sides. The wrecks remain untouched by treaty. The Atlantic, by unwritten agreement, keeps them as war graves. No flags, no plaques, only coordinates on naval charts marked "Do Not Disturb." And perhaps that is fitting. The men who once ruled the depths sought anonymity in combat unseen, unheard. Now they have it forever. If you could stand, above their resting places, hundreds of meters down, you would see nothing but endless blue, fading to black. No light reaches them, no sound except the slow hum of currents brushing the rusted hulls. Their instruments are still there. Their depth gauges still point to 600 feet. It is about discovery, the moment, when human belief collided with reality and lost. The German crews learned that courage could not outswim calculation. The Allies learned that progress, once unleashed, carries no mercy. And the ocean vast, impersonal, eternal, learned nothing at all. It simply closed over the wrecks and continued its rhythm, as it had before men decided to wage war beneath its surface. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.